I'm Melissa Harper, and 6 months ago, I thought I knew what workplace harassment looked like. I was wrong. What I experienced under David Sterling's supervision wasn't just professional bullying, it was a calculated campaign designed to break me down systematically, piece by piece, until I would quietly disappear from Blackstone Industries like so many others before me. But David made one critical mistake. He underestimated exactly how much evidence a process improvement specialist could gather when pushed to her breaking point. The morning of my performance review, scheduled deliberately for 7 a.m. when the building would be empty. David leaned across his desk with that familiar predatory smile. "Nobody's going to hear you cry when I tell you how incompetent you really are," he whispered, his voice cutting through the silence of the vacant office. The clock on the wall blinked 7 a.m. exactly. This review had been scheduled early for a reason, and we both knew it wasn't about privacy, it was about isolation. But when his office door opened 10 minutes later, everything shifted. Before I tell you what made David Sterling's face drain of all color that morning, you need to understand what led to this moment. You need to know about the 6 months of psychological warfare, the systematic destruction of my reputation, and how I methodically documented every single move he made against me. Because what happened in that conference room wasn't just revenge, it was justice served cold and calculated, exactly the way David had taught me to operate. My transfer to the production strategy department had seemed like a promotion. At 34, I'd built a solid reputation in process development, known for my meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to quality standards. Blackstone Industries prided itself on precision manufacturing, and I'd spent 8 years helping them maintain that reputation. When the opportunity arose to work directly under David Sterling, the so-called efficiency expert, I saw it as my chance to make a real impact on the company's strategic direction. David's reputation preceded him. He was known as the man who could streamline any department, eliminate waste, and boost productivity numbers across the board. What wasn't mentioned in the company newsletters was how he achieved these miraculous results. The first warning sign should have been the way other employees looked when his name was mentioned, a mixture of fear and resignation that I mistook for professional respect. Our first meeting took place in his corner office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the production floor. David sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled, studying me with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. "We need someone like you here, Melissa," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Someone who understands systems, who can see the big picture. But you'll also need to understand that this department operates differently. We move fast, we make tough decisions, and we don't have time for perfectionist tendencies that slow down progress." I should have recognized the warning embedded in those words. Instead, I nodded eagerly, ready to prove myself worthy of this new challenge. The office atmosphere was immediately different from process development. Here, conversations stopped when David entered a room. Employees kept their heads down, worked in virtual silence, and seemed to communicate through a series of nervous glances and carefully neutral expressions. "The key to success here," David continued, "is knowing your place in the hierarchy. I've built this team carefully, and everyone contributes according to their capabilities. Some people are natural leaders, others are better suited to following directions. The sooner you figure out which category you fall into, the smoother your transition will be." Looking back, I realized this was David's standard orientation speech, a carefully crafted introduction designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability. He was already positioning me as someone who needed to prove herself, someone whose natural inclinations toward thoroughness and quality control would be reframed as obstacles to efficiency. The manipulation started subtly, as it always did with David. During my first week, he would make small corrections to my reports, always with a patronizing smile. "You're overthinking this, Melissa," he would say, marking through entire sections of analysis with his red pen. "We need actionable insights, not academic dissertations. I'm sure you meant well. But this level of detail actually confuses the decision makers." Initially, I accepted these corrections as part of the learning process. Every new position required adjustments. and I was willing to adapt my communication style to match departmental expectations. But the changes David made weren't just about formatting or length. They were systematically removing the cautionary notes and risk assessments that were fundamental to responsible process analysis. When I questioned why he was deleting a section about potential quality control issues in a new manufacturing protocol, David's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Melissa, you're focusing on problems that might never materialize. Our job is to move projects forward, not to create roadblocks. The engineering team has already approved these specifications. Trust their expertise. But I knew the engineering team's approval was based on preliminary data, not the comprehensive analysis I'd conducted. The quality control issues weren't theoretical. They were based on pattern recognition from similar processes I'd evaluated in my previous role. David wasn't just editing my reports. He was deliberately removing critical information that could prevent expensive mistakes down the line. The isolation tactics began in my second week. Important emails would arrive in my inbox hours after meetings had been moved or canceled. Conference calls would be rescheduled with updates sent to everyone except me. I would arrive at meeting rooms to find empty chairs and confused looks from security guards who informed me that the gathering had been moved to a different location at the last minute. Communication breakdowns happen, David explained when I brought this to his attention. You're still learning our systems. Maybe you should double-check your calendar settings or talk to IT about email delivery issues. We can't hold up progress waiting for everyone to catch up. The gaslighting was masterful in its subtlety. Every incident was framed as my failure to adapt, my inability to keep up with the fast-paced environment, my technical incompetence with basic office systems. David never raised his voice or showed obvious hostility. Instead, he maintained a facade of patient mentorship while systematically undermining my ability to function effectively in the role. Other team members began to treat me with the careful distance of people who had learned not to associate with someone marked for elimination. Conversations would halt when I approached groups in the break room. Invitations to informal team lunches stopped arriving. I found myself eating alone, working late in an empty office, and gradually becoming invisible within the department I was supposed to be helping improve. The psychological impact was exactly what David intended. I began to question my own competence, wondering if I really was as slow to adapt as his feedback suggested. The confident professional who had excelled in process development started to doubt her abilities, second-guessing every decision and overanalyzing every interaction for signs of disapproval. But something inside me refused to accept this narrative completely. Maybe it was 8 years of training in systematic analysis, or maybe it was an instinct for self-preservation. But I started documenting everything, every meeting reschedule, every email delay. Every subtle put-down was recorded in a private file on my personal laptop. I told myself I was just trying to identify patterns, to understand where the communication breakdowns were occurring so I could fix them. The documentation habit probably saved my career and possibly my sanity, because what started as defensive record-keeping would eventually become the foundation for David's downfall. By my third week, David's tactics had escalated from subtle manipulation to open professional humiliation. During a team meeting with 12 other department heads, he interrupted my presentation about efficiency improvements in the circuit board assembly line. "I'm going to stop you right there, Melissa," he said, his voice carrying across the conference room. "This is exactly what I was talking about in our one-on-one meetings. You're getting lost in unnecessary details instead of focusing on actionable solutions." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me as David stood up and moved to the whiteboard. "Let me show you what Melissa was trying to communicate," he continued, essentially taking over my presentation while reducing my carefully researched recommendations to a series of oversimplified bullet points. The key insight here is that we can increase throughput by 17% through simple scheduling adjustments. Everything else is just noise. But my recommendations weren't just about throughput. They included critical safety protocols and quality checkpoints that David had eliminated in his simplified version. I tried to interject, to explain that the additional steps were necessary to maintain our ISO certification standards. But David cut me off with a gesture. "Melissa, I appreciate your attention to detail. But we're not running a university research project here. We need results, not theoretical frameworks. Why don't you sit back down and let me finish explaining how this will actually work in practice? The humiliation was complete and deliberate. In front of senior leadership, David had positioned me as someone who couldn't distinguish between important information and irrelevant academic overthinking. He had taken credit for my analysis while discarding the parts that would actually ensure successful implementation. And he had done it all while maintaining the facade of patient mentorship. After the meeting, several department heads approached me with sympathetic looks. "Don't take it personally," whispered Janet from Quality Assurance. "David's just very focused on bottom-line results. He's not trying to make you look bad. He's trying to make the whole department look good." But I knew better. This wasn't about departmental success or bottom-line results. This was about establishing a clear hierarchy where David was the source of all good ideas, and I was the obstacle to progress who needed constant correction and guidance. The pattern repeated itself in every subsequent meeting. My contributions would be interrupted, modified, or dismissed entirely. Credit for successful initiatives would be redistributed to other team members, while any problems or setbacks would be traced back to my perfectionist tendencies or failure to understand practical constraints. During one particularly brutal staff meeting, David spent 15 minutes explaining why my proposal for updated safety protocols was unrealistic and overly cautious. He used phrases like paralysis by analysis and bureaucratic thinking to describe my approach, while presenting his own streamlined version that eliminated most of the protective measures I'd recommended. "The thing about safety protocols," David explained to the room, "is that they can become security blankets that prevent us from taking necessary risks." Melissa's background in process development has given her a very conservative outlook, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not appropriate for our current growth targets. I wanted to stand up and explain that my conservative outlook was based on industry standards and legal requirements, not personal preference. I wanted to tell the room that the safety protocols David was dismissing as unnecessary had been developed in response to actual incidents at similar manufacturing facilities. But I had learned that interrupting David's presentations only led to more public humiliation and further evidence of my inability to function as a team player. Instead, I sat silently, taking notes and adding another entry to my growing documentation file. Because I was beginning to understand that David Sterling wasn't just a demanding boss or a micromanager. He was something much more dangerous. He was a systematic destroyer of people, and I was his current target. The psychological warfare intensified during my 4th week when David began scheduling frequent performance coaching sessions. These meetings would be called with minimal notice, often disrupting my work on critical projects. David would sit across from me in his office, reviewing my recent work with the detailed attention of someone conducting a forensic audit. "I'm concerned about your integration into our team culture," he would begin, his voice filled with manufactured concern. "Several colleagues have mentioned that you seem isolated, that you're not participating in the collaborative environment we've worked so hard to build here." The irony was staggering. David had systematically excluded me from team activities, undermined my contributions in public forums, and created an atmosphere where associating with me was professionally dangerous. Now he was blaming me for the isolation he had orchestrated. "I want to help you succeed, Melissa," he continued. "But I need you to meet me halfway. You have to be willing to accept feedback, to adapt your working style, to show some flexibility in your approach. Right now, you're coming across as someone who thinks they know better than everyone else, and that's not sustainable in a leadership role." These coaching sessions were masterclasses in psychological manipulation. David would present himself as a concerned mentor trying to help a struggling employee, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that I was difficult, inflexible, and resistant to constructive criticism. He would reference vague conversations with unnamed colleagues, cite examples of my supposed professional deficiencies, and offer solutions that invariably involved me accepting responsibility for problems he had created. The most insidious part was how he framed these sessions as confidential, supportive conversations. "I don't want to have to document any of this," he would say, closing my personnel file with a theatrical gesture. I'd much rather work with you informally to address these issues before they become serious problems. But I need to see some effort on your part. I need to see that you're committed to being part of the solution. The implied threat was clear: conform to David's vision of how I should behave, or face formal disciplinary action. Accept his version of events, or see your career at Blackstone Industries come to an abrupt end. The coaching sessions were designed to make me complicit in my own destruction, to get me to agree that I was the problem and that David was graciously offering me a chance to redeem myself. But I refused to internalize his narrative. Instead, I continued documenting everything, including detailed summaries of our coaching sessions written immediately after each meeting. I noted the specific phrases he used, the way he positioned himself as helpful while delivering threats, and the pattern of escalation that was becoming increasingly obvious. During one particularly intense coaching session, David leaned back in his chair and studied me with unconcealed calculation. "You know, Melissa, I've been thinking about your long-term career trajectory here at Blackstone. You're clearly intelligent. You have strong technical skills, but you're struggling with the interpersonal aspects of leadership. Maybe we should consider whether this role is the right fit for your particular strengths." The suggestion that I might be better suited for a different position was presented as career counseling. But I understood the real message: conform or be transferred to a role where I could cause less disruption to David's carefully controlled environment. He was offering me a face-saving exit strategy before he moved to more aggressive tactics. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, "but I'm committed to making this position work. I believe I can contribute significantly to the department's goals if I can get better integrated into the team's communication patterns." David's smile was predatory. "I admire your persistence, Melissa, I really do. But sometimes the most professional thing to do is recognize when a situation isn't working out. I'd hate to see you struggle unnecessarily when there might be opportunities elsewhere that would better match your working style." The threat was becoming less subtle. David was moving toward the final phase of his campaign, where he would manufacture a crisis that would justify my removal from the department. I needed to be ready for whatever he was planning, because I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about my career. It was about something much more dangerous. The breakthrough came during my 5th week when I discovered the production safety issue that would ultimately bring down David Sterling's entire operation. I was reviewing quality control data for the new automotive component line when I noticed discrepancies in the stress testing results. The numbers didn't match the specifications that had been approved by our engineering partners, and the variance was significant enough to potentially cause product failure under normal operating conditions. This wasn't a minor technical issue or a statistical anomaly. It was a serious safety defect that could result in mechanical failure, property damage, or even injury to end users. The automotive components we manufactured were used in braking systems, and any failure could have catastrophic consequences. I immediately compiled a comprehensive report documenting the testing discrepancies, the potential failure modes, and the recommended corrective actions. This was exactly the kind of critical safety issue that my process development background had trained me to identify and address. I prepared detailed documentation showing how the current production parameters were outside acceptable tolerances and presented multiple options for bringing the process back into compliance. When I brought this report to David's attention, his reaction was unlike anything I had experienced during our previous interactions. Instead of his usual condescending patience, he displayed genuine alarm. Not about the safety issue, but about my discovery of it. "Where did you get this data?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "These testing results are preliminary, not final specifications. You're drawing conclusions based on incomplete information." But I had verified the data through multiple sources, cross-referencing the internal quality control reports with the specifications provided by our automotive clients. The discrepancies were real, documented, and potentially catastrophic. "David, these aren't preliminary results," I explained, showing him the date stamps and approval signatures on the testing documentation. "These are the final specifications that were used to set up the production line. The variance is significant enough to require immediate attention." David's face had gone pale, and for the first time since I'd started working under him, he seemed genuinely rattled. He studied my report with the intense focus of someone looking for flaws in an argument. But the data was solid, the analysis was thorough, and the conclusions were inescapable. "You're overthinking this," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "These kinds of minor variations are normal in manufacturing. The engineering team has already approved these specifications, and we're not going to halt production based on theoretical concerns." But this wasn't theoretical. I had identified a measurable deviation from approved safety standards that could result in product failure. The responsible course of action was to immediately notify the engineering team, halt production until the issue could be resolved, and implement corrective measures to ensure compliance with safety specifications. "I need to report this to quality assurance," I said, reaching for my phone. "They'll want to review the data and determine the appropriate response." David's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. "You're not reporting anything to anyone," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to modify this report to remove the alarmist language and focus on the actual data. These minor variations don't constitute a safety issue. And I'm not going to let you create a panic over nothing." The physical contact was brief, but the message was clear. David was willing to use intimidation to prevent me from reporting a legitimate safety concern. This wasn't about departmental efficiency or productivity metrics. This was about covering up a potentially dangerous defect to protect production schedules and avoid costly corrections. "I can't do that," I said, pulling my hand away. "The data shows a clear safety issue that needs to be addressed. I have a professional and legal obligation to report this." David's expression shifted from frustration to cold calculation. "Melissa, you're still learning how things work in this department. We don't create problems where none exist. We don't halt production based on theoretical concerns, and we don't make decisions that could cost the company millions of dollars without consulting senior leadership." He stood up and moved to his computer, pulling up what appeared to be a modified version of my report. "This is what you're going to submit," he said, turning the screen toward me. "I've removed the unnecessarily alarmist language and focused on the actual data. The engineering team can review it and determine if any adjustments are needed." But David's version had eliminated all references to safety concerns, removed the failure mode analysis, and presented the testing discrepancies as minor variations that fell within acceptable tolerances. He had transformed a critical safety alert into a routine technical update that would likely be filed and forgotten. "I won't put my name on a report that misrepresents safety data," I said. "If you want to submit a modified version, you'll have to do it yourself." David's smile was coldly triumphant. "Actually, Melissa, all reports from this department go out under my signature anyway. Your job is to provide the technical analysis, and my job is to present it in a way that serves the company's interests. Consider this a learning opportunity about how strategic communication works in a leadership environment." I watched him save the modified report and add it to the outgoing correspondence queue. He was going to suppress critical safety information to protect production schedules, and he was going to use his authority to prevent me from reporting the issue through proper channels. That night, I made copies of both versions of the report, my original analysis and David's sanitized version. I also documented the conversation where he had physically prevented me from contacting quality assurance and explicitly ordered me to suppress safety information. This was no longer just about workplace harassment or professional bullying. David Sterling was engaged in potentially criminal behavior that could endanger public safety. The next morning, I attempted to contact Janet in quality assurance directly, but she informed me that any safety concerns from production strategy needed to be submitted through David's office. When I tried to reach the engineering team that had originally approved the specifications, I was told that all communication regarding the automotive component line needed to be coordinated through production strategy to avoid confusion. David had effectively isolated me from every avenue for reporting the safety issue. He had used his position and his relationships within the company to create a barrier between me and anyone who might take action on my concerns. The system that was supposed to protect against exactly this kind of cover-up had been subverted by someone who understood how to manipulate corporate hierarchies. But David made one critical error in his campaign to suppress my safety report. He assumed that I would accept his authority and abandon my concerns rather than risk my career by challenging him directly. He didn't understand that some principles are more important than job security. And he certainly didn't anticipate the level of documentation I had been maintaining throughout our increasingly hostile relationship. That evening, I began preparing for what I knew would be the final confrontation. I compiled every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past 5 weeks. The emails that had been delayed or misdirected, the meeting invitations that had been rescinded, the public humiliations in team meetings, the coaching sessions designed to break down my confidence, and now the suppression of critical safety information. I organized the evidence chronologically, showing the clear pattern of escalation from subtle manipulation to open intimidation to what could only be described as criminal negligence. I documented David's methods with the same systematic thoroughness I had once applied to process improvement, creating a comprehensive case study of workplace psychological warfare. The safety report became the centerpiece of my documentation, but it was supported by months of evidence showing David's willingness to prioritize his own interests over professional standards, employee welfare, and public safety. The man who had spent 5 weeks trying to destroy my credibility had inadvertently provided me with overwhelming evidence of his own misconduct. I knew that challenging David directly would be professional suicide unless I could present an airtight case that left no room for interpretation or denial. I needed to anticipate his responses, counter his likely defenses, and present my evidence in a way that would compel immediate action from senior leadership. The performance review scheduled for 7 a.m. was obviously intended to be the final act in David's campaign against me. The early hour would ensure privacy, the isolated location would prevent witnesses, and the formal review format would provide him with the documentation needed to justify my termination. He was planning to end my career at Blackstone Industries in a way that would make it difficult for me to challenge his decision or seek recourse through normal channels. But I had spent the past week preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to face it alone. My first call was to Diana Mitchell, the Director of Human Resources. I had worked with Diana on several process improvement projects in my previous role, and I knew her to be someone who took professional standards seriously. More importantly, she had the authority to bypass David's hierarchical controls and conduct an independent investigation. Diana, I need to speak with you about a serious situation in production strategy, I said, choosing my words carefully. I've discovered safety issues that are being suppressed, and I have evidence of systematic harassment designed to prevent me from reporting them. Diana's response was immediate and professional. Melissa, these are serious allegations. I need you to document everything and be prepared to present your evidence formally. Can you be in my office at 6:30 a.m. tomorrow? My second call was to James Patterson, the company's general counsel. The legal implications of suppressing safety data were potentially enormous, and I needed to ensure that someone with appropriate authority was aware of the situation before David could take further action to cover his tracks. James, I'm calling to report a potential safety cover-up that could expose the company to significant liability, I said. I have documented evidence of a supervisor preventing me from reporting safety defects through proper channels. James's response was equally direct. Melissa, you need to preserve all documentation and avoid any further communication with the supervisor in question. I'm going to have someone from my office present when you meet with HR tomorrow. My final call was to Marcus Thompson, the Vice President of Manufacturing Operations. Marcus had overall responsibility for production quality and safety standards, and he would be the person ultimately accountable if David's cover-up resulted in product failure or injury. Marcus, I've identified safety defects in the automotive component line that are being suppressed by production strategy management, I said. I have the original testing data and documentation showing how the safety information was removed from reports. Marcus's response was immediate and decisive. Melissa, I'm putting a hold on all automotive component shipments effective immediately. I want you to present your findings to me and the engineering team first thing tomorrow morning. By 10 p.m. that night, I'd created a coalition of senior leadership who were aware of the situation and prepared to take action. David's carefully constructed isolation had been broken, and his ability to control the narrative had been eliminated. The performance review that he had scheduled as my professional execution would instead become his own accountability hearing. I spent the rest of the night preparing my presentation, organizing my evidence, and mentally rehearsing the confrontation that would determine both our careers. David Sterling had taught me a great deal about strategic thinking, systematic planning, and the importance of controlling information flow. Tomorrow morning, I would demonstrate just how well I'd learned those lessons. The morning of the performance review. I arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m. to find David already in his office, reviewing what appeared to be a thick folder of documentation. He looked up when I knocked on his door, and his expression was coldly triumphant. "Right on time, Melissa," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I appreciate punctuality, especially for important conversations like this one." He opened the folder and began reading from what was clearly a prepared script. "After careful review of your performance over the past 5 weeks, I have serious concerns about your ability to function effectively in this role. Your resistance to feedback, your inability to adapt to our departmental culture, and your tendency to create problems rather than solve them have made it impossible for me to recommend your continuation in production strategy." David's voice was measured and professional, but there was an underlying satisfaction that he couldn't quite conceal. This was the moment he had been working towards since my first day in the department, and he was savoring the anticipation of my defeat. "I have documented multiple instances of insubordination, failure to follow directives, and behavior that has disrupted team cohesion," he continued, turning pages in his folder. "Your most recent attempt to circumvent my authority by independently contacting other departments about routine technical issues demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of professional hierarchy and chain of command." He was referring to my attempt to report the safety issue, but he had reframed it as insubordination rather than professional responsibility. David had prepared his version of events carefully, creating a narrative that would justify my termination while protecting himself from any consequences. "Effective immediately, I'm recommending your transfer out of production strategy," David said, sliding a document across the desk. "I've arranged for a position in technical documentation that might be more suitable for your particular skills and working style. The transfer would be lateral, so there would be no impact on your salary or benefits." Technical documentation was where careers went to die at Blackstone Industries. It was an isolated department that handled routine maintenance of equipment manuals and safety procedures. Important work, but completely removed from any strategic decision-making or advancement opportunities. The transfer would effectively end my career trajectory while providing David with a face-saving way to eliminate me from his department. "I want you to understand that this isn't personal," David continued, his voice filled with manufactured regret. "You're clearly intelligent and capable, but you're not a good fit for the leadership environment we've built here. Sometimes the most professional thing to do is recognize when a situation isn't working and make the necessary adjustments." He was offering me the same script he had probably used with his previous victims, a way to accept defeat gracefully while allowing him to maintain his reputation as a reasonable manager who had tried to help a struggling employee. The early morning timing was designed to prevent me from seeking support or advice, to force me to make a decision while I was isolated and vulnerable. But I wasn't isolated, and I wasn't vulnerable. I had spent the past week preparing for this moment, and I was ready to turn David's carefully orchestrated finale into his own professional destruction. "Before I respond to your recommendation," I said, "I think you should know that I've been documenting our interactions since my second week in the department. I have comprehensive evidence of harassment, intimidation, and suppression of safety information." David's expression shifted from confidence to wariness. "Melissa, I don't know what you think you've documented, but I've been nothing but professional in all our interactions. If you're unhappy with the feedback you've received, that's understandable. But it doesn't change the fact that you haven't been able to meet the performance standards required for this role." I opened my laptop and began displaying the evidence I had compiled. I have records of 47 instances where meeting times were changed without notifying me, 32 emails that were delayed or misdirected to prevent my participation in department activities, and detailed notes from every coaching session where you used intimidation tactics to undermine my confidence. David leaned forward, studying the screen with growing alarm. These are just normal workplace communications. The fact that you've been secretly documenting routine interactions shows exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that makes you unsuitable for a leadership role. But I wasn't finished. I also have both versions of the automotive safety report, the original that identified critical defects, and the modified version where you removed all safety warnings. I have a recording of our conversation where you physically prevented me from reporting safety issues and explicitly ordered me to suppress critical information. David's face had gone pale, and his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the phone. You're not authorized to record conversations without consent. If you've been secretly recording our meetings, you've violated company policy and potentially broken the law. I'm not recording anything, I said calmly. But I have detailed contemporaneous notes of every conversation, including exact quotes of your threats and instructions to suppress safety data. I also have witnesses who can confirm your pattern of behavior with previous employees. The office door opened, and Diana Mitchell entered with James Patterson and Marcus Thompson. David's triumphant performance review had just become a disciplinary hearing with the three most powerful people in the company. Mr. Sterling, Diana said, her voice professionally neutral. We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention. Melissa has presented evidence of harassment and safety violations that require immediate investigation. David's carefully constructed facade crumbled as he realized that his isolation tactics had failed, that his victim had found a way to bypass his controls and reach senior leadership. The man who had spent 5 weeks systematically destroying my credibility was now facing the very people who had the power to end his career. This is obviously a disgruntled employee trying to retaliate for legitimate performance feedback, David said, his voice rising with desperation. Melissa has been resistant to coaching from day one, and now she's making false accusations to avoid accountability for her own failures. But Marcus Thompson was already reviewing the safety documentation on my laptop. Mr. Sterling, this shows clear evidence of safety defects that should have been reported immediately. Can you explain why this information was removed from the final report? David's response was increasingly frantic. Those were minor variations within acceptable tolerances. Melissa's background in process development has made her overly cautious about routine manufacturing variations. I made editorial changes to prevent unnecessary alarm about non-issues. James Patterson had been studying the harassment documentation, and his expression was grimly professional. Mr. Sterling, we have 47 documented instances of deliberate exclusion, 32 communication failures that show a clear pattern, and detailed records of coaching sessions that appear designed to create a hostile work environment. This goes far beyond legitimate performance management. The confrontation that David had orchestrated as my professional execution had become his own accountability hearing. The evidence I had compiled over 5 weeks of systematic documentation was overwhelming, irrefutable, and damaging enough to end his career at Blackstone Industries. Diana Mitchell stood up and moved toward the door. Mr. Sterling, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building, and you're prohibited from contacting any employees or accessing company systems until this matter is resolved. David's last words as he was led from the office were directed at me. This isn't over, Melissa. You have no idea what you've started. But I knew exactly what I had started. I had started the process of accountability that would ultimately reveal the full extent of David Sterling's misconduct and ensure that no other employee would suffer the systematic harassment I had endured. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, 3 other former employees came forward with similar experiences of harassment and intimidation under David's supervision. The pattern was identical in each case: systematic isolation, public humiliation, suppression of professional contributions, and ultimately, forced resignation or transfer to lesser positions. The safety violations proved to be even more serious than my original report had indicated. The automotive component defects could have resulted in brake system failures, potentially causing accidents, injuries, or deaths. David's suppression of safety information had exposed the company to enormous liability and regulatory sanctions. Marcus Thompson personally called our automotive clients to explain the situation and coordinate the recall of potentially defective components. The cost to the company was estimated in the millions of dollars, but the cost of allowing defective brake components to remain in circulation could have been catastrophic. David Sterling was terminated for cause and faced potential criminal charges for endangering public safety. The company implemented new policies to prevent the suppression of safety information and established independent reporting channels that bypassed departmental hierarchies. I was promoted to Director of Quality Assurance, reporting directly to the executive team and responsible for ensuring that safety concerns received appropriate attention regardless of their impact on production schedules or departmental politics. 3 months later, I received a letter from one of David's previous victims. "I wish I had been as brave as you were," she wrote. "I let him drive me out of the company rather than fighting back. Thank you for stopping him before he could hurt anyone else." The letter reminded me that workplace harassment isn't just about individual careers. It's about creating environments where people can do their jobs safely and effectively. David Sterling's systematic campaign of psychological warfare had been enabled by a culture that prioritized hierarchy over accountability, efficiency over safety, and individual power over collective responsibility. The morning that David had scheduled my destruction became the beginning of his own accountability. The performance review that was supposed to end my career at Blackstone Industries instead launched me into a position where I could ensure that no other employee would face the kind of systematic harassment I had endured. Looking back, I realized that David Sterling taught me more about leadership than any business school course or management seminar ever could. He showed me how power can be abused, how systems can be manipulated, and how individual courage can overcome institutional indifference. Most importantly, he demonstrated that the most effective way to defeat a systematic destroyer of people is through systematic documentation and strategic alliance building. The revenge I took wasn't personal, it was professional. It wasn't about getting back at David Sterling for his treatment of me, it was about ensuring that his methods could never be used against anyone else. The morning he tried to destroy my career became the morning he destroyed his own, not through any action I took against him, but through the natural consequences of his own misconduct finally being exposed to the light. The empty office at 7 a.m. where he had planned to break me down became the place where he finally faced accountability for years of systematic abuse. The performance review he had scheduled to end my career became the hearing that ended his. And the documentation habits he had inadvertently taught me through his harassment became the evidence that ensured he would never have the opportunity to harm another employee. In the end, David Sterling's greatest failure wasn't his willingness to suppress safety information or his systematic harassment of employees. It was his fundamental misunderstanding of the people he was trying to destroy. He assumed that everyone would respond to intimidation the way his previous victims had, by quietly accepting defeat and disappearing from his sphere of influence. He never considered that someone might document his methods, build strategic alliances, and turn his own tactics against him. The weeks following David's termination brought a series of revelations that painted an even darker picture of his tenure in production strategy. The internal investigation uncovered evidence of falsified performance reviews, manipulated productivity metrics, and systematic suppression of employee concerns that went back nearly 3 years. David hadn't just been harassing individual employees. He had been running a department-wide campaign of psychological warfare designed to eliminate anyone who might challenge his authority or question his methods. The pattern was always the same: identify employees with strong technical skills or independent thinking, isolate them from department activities, undermine their confidence through constant criticism and public humiliation, and ultimately force them to resign or accept transfers to lesser positions. The employees who remained were those who had learned to keep their heads down, avoid challenging David's decisions, and prioritize their own survival over professional integrity. Janet from Quality Assurance admitted during her interview with investigators that she had suspected David's methods for months, but had been afraid to speak up. He made it clear that questioning his decisions was career suicide, she explained. We all knew what happened to people who crossed him. It was easier to just avoid his department and hope someone else would eventually figure out what he was doing. The culture of fear David had created extended far beyond production strategy. Other departments had learned to avoid challenging his decisions, questioning his data, or reporting concerns about his methods. He had effectively insulated himself from accountability by making it professionally dangerous for anyone to oppose him. The automotive safety cover-up was particularly disturbing because it revealed David's willingness to prioritize his own interests over public safety. The investigation showed that he had been aware of potential defects for weeks before I discovered them, but had chosen to suppress the information rather than deal with the production delays and cost overruns that would result from addressing the problems. Sterling knew that reporting safety issues would reflect poorly on his management of the department. Marcus Thompson explained during the board meeting where the investigation results were presented. He was more concerned about protecting his reputation than protecting the public from potentially dangerous products. The legal ramifications were severe. The company faced regulatory sanctions, customer lawsuits, and potential criminal charges related to the safety cover-up. David's personal liability was even greater, as he had knowingly suppressed information that could have prevented accidents and injuries. But the human cost was perhaps the most significant. The investigation identified 7 employees who had left the company over the past 3 years due to David's harassment. These were talented professionals who had been systematically driven out of their careers, their confidence destroyed, their professional reputations damaged by carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological warfare. Some of these former employees were contacted as part of the investigation, and their stories were heartbreakingly similar to my own experience. The same isolation tactics, the same public humiliation, the same coaching sessions designed to break down their confidence and force them to accept responsibility for problems David had created. "I thought I was losing my mind," explained one former employee who had been driven out of the department 6 months before my arrival. "He was so good at making it seem like everything was my fault, like I was just too incompetent to understand how things worked. It took me months after leaving to realize that it wasn't me, it was him." The psychological impact on these employees was profound and long-lasting. Several reported ongoing anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting supervisors in subsequent positions. David's systematic destruction of their confidence had effects that extended far beyond their time at Blackstone Industries. The company implemented a comprehensive support program for former employees who had been affected by David's harassment, including counseling services, career placement assistance, and offers to return to positions within the company. 3 of the 7 former employees accepted offers to return, while the others received settlements that helped them rebuild their careers elsewhere. The policy changes implemented in response to the investigation were extensive and far-reaching. New procedures were established for reporting safety concerns that bypassed departmental hierarchies. Anonymous reporting systems were created to identify harassment and intimidation, and regular training was mandated for all supervisors on appropriate management techniques and professional conduct. Most importantly, the company established independent oversight of production departments to ensure that safety concerns received appropriate attention regardless of their impact on schedules or budgets. The Quality Assurance Department was restructured to report directly to the executive team, with authority to halt production and investigate safety issues without departmental interference. My role as Director of Quality Assurance was specifically designed to prevent the kind of systematic suppression of safety information that David had orchestrated. I had the authority to investigate any safety concern, access any production data, and communicate directly with regulatory agencies and customers when necessary. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's attempt to destroy my career had ultimately resulted in my promotion to a position where I could ensure that his methods would never be used again. The systematic documentation skills he had inadvertently taught me through his harassment became the foundation for the comprehensive quality assurance protocols that would protect both employees and the public from future misconduct. The transformation of production strategy following David's departure was dramatic and immediate. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation was replaced by collaborative problem-solving and open communication. Employees who had been silent for years began speaking up about process improvements, safety concerns, and operational issues that had been suppressed under David's regime. The productivity metrics that David had used to justify his harsh methods proved to be largely fabricated. His efficiency improvements had been achieved through the systematic suppression of quality control measures, safety protocols, and employee feedback. When proper procedures were restored, productivity initially decreased, but product quality and safety improved dramatically. Within 6 months, the department was operating more effectively than it had during David's tenure. With higher employee satisfaction, better safety records, and improved customer feedback, the toxic culture he had created was replaced by an environment where employees felt safe to report concerns, suggest improvements, and challenge decisions when necessary. The legal proceedings against David Sterling continued for more than a year. He faced multiple civil lawsuits from former employees, regulatory sanctions related to the safety cover-up, and potential criminal charges for endangering public safety. His professional reputation was permanently destroyed, and his ability to find similar positions in the manufacturing industry was effectively eliminated. The settlements with former employees totaled several $1,000,000, but the real cost to David was the complete destruction of the career he had built through systematic intimidation and harassment. The man who had spent years destroying other people's professional lives found his own career ended by the natural consequences of his own misconduct. I testified in several of the legal proceedings, providing detailed documentation of David's methods and their impact on both employees and public safety. The systematic records I'd maintained during my 5 weeks under his supervision became crucial evidence in establishing the pattern of harassment and intimidation that had characterized his management style. The testimony was emotionally difficult, requiring me to relive the psychological warfare I had endured and to describe in detail the methods David had used to systematically undermine my confidence and isolate me from my colleagues. But it was also empowering to see how the documentation I had maintained could be used to ensure accountability and prevent future harm. The other former employees who testified described similar experiences, creating a comprehensive picture of David's systematic approach to employee destruction. The consistency of his methods across multiple victims made it impossible for him to claim that the harassment was unintentional or that the problems were due to individual employee deficiencies. The safety violations were particularly damaging to David's defense. The evidence showed that he had knowingly suppressed information about potentially dangerous defects, prioritizing his own interests over public safety. The potential consequences of his actions, brake system failures that could have caused accidents, injuries, or deaths, made his conduct especially egregious. The regulatory sanctions included significant financial penalties and ongoing oversight of the company's safety procedures. Federal investigators conducted a comprehensive review of all products manufactured under David's supervision, resulting in additional recalls and safety notifications that cost the company millions of dollars. But the regulatory response also validated the importance of the action I had taken in documenting and reporting David's misconduct. The investigators specifically noted that the systematic suppression of safety information represented a serious threat to public welfare that could have resulted in catastrophic consequences if it had continued. The media coverage of the case brought national attention to the issue of workplace harassment and safety cover-ups in manufacturing industries. My experience became a case study in how systematic documentation and strategic alliance building could overcome institutional indifference and hold powerful individuals accountable for their misconduct. I was invited to speak at several industry conferences about the importance of creating safe reporting channels for safety concerns and establishing systems to prevent the suppression of critical information. The presentation I developed focused on the systematic nature of David's methods and the organizational changes necessary to prevent similar incidents. The speaking opportunities led to consulting work with other companies that were seeking to improve their safety reporting procedures and prevent workplace harassment. I found that David's methods were disturbingly common across the industry, and that many organizations had developed cultures that enabled systematic abuse of employees. Working with these companies reinforced my understanding that workplace harassment isn't just about individual bad actors. It's about systems and cultures that allow destructive behavior to flourish unchallenged. The most effective prevention strategies involved comprehensive changes to organizational structures, reporting procedures, and accountability mechanisms. The experience also taught me about the importance of supporting other employees who might be facing similar harassment. I received hundreds of emails from people who had experienced workplace abuse, many of whom were still trapped in situations similar to what I had endured under David's supervision. These communications reinforced the importance of the stand I had taken. Every person who reached out represented someone who had been systematically undermined, intimidated, and potentially driven from their career by supervisors who used David's methods of psychological warfare. Some of these individuals were able to use the strategies I had developed: systematic documentation, strategic alliance building, and comprehensive evidence presentation to address their own situations. Others found the courage to report harassment they had been enduring in silence, knowing that someone else had successfully challenged similar abuse. The ripple effects of David's accountability extended far beyond Blackstone Industries. The case established legal precedents for holding supervisor accountable for systematic harassment and demonstrated the importance of comprehensive documentation in proving patterns of misconduct. The safety violations aspect of the case led to new industry standards for reporting and investigating potential defects. The systematic suppression of safety information that David had orchestrated became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing production pressures to override safety considerations. 2 years after David's termination, I received a letter from a safety inspector at a different manufacturing company. "The Sterling case has become required reading in our training program," he wrote. "We use it to teach our employees about the importance of reporting safety concerns and to show supervisors what happens when they try to suppress critical information." The letter reminded me that the accountability David had faced wasn't just about justice for his victims. It was about creating a safer and more ethical work environment for everyone in the industry. The systematic methods he had used to destroy employees and suppress safety information had been exposed, documented, and made public in a way that would prevent their use by others. The personal cost of challenging David had been significant. The 5 weeks of harassment had taken a psychological toll that required months of counseling to overcome. The legal proceedings had been emotionally exhausting and professionally disruptive. The public attention had been both validating and overwhelming. But the professional and personal growth that resulted from the experience was equally significant. I had learned to trust my instincts, to document everything, and to build strategic alliances that could overcome institutional indifference. I had developed the courage to stand up for my principles even when it meant risking my career. Most importantly, I had learned that individual action could create systemic change. The documentation I had maintained during 5 weeks of harassment had not only ended David's career, but had also led to organizational changes that would protect countless other employees from similar abuse. The promotion to Director of Quality Assurance had given me the authority to implement the kinds of safety reporting procedures and harassment prevention systems that could have prevented David's misconduct from continuing unchallenged. I was able to create the kind of work environment I had wished for during those difficult weeks under his supervision. The position also allowed me to mentor other employees who might be facing similar challenges. I made it a priority to be accessible to anyone who had concerns about harassment, intimidation, or safety issues. The door to my office was always open, and I made sure that everyone knew they could report concerns without fear of retaliation. This mentoring role became one of the most rewarding aspects of my career. I was able to help other employees develop the documentation skills and strategic thinking that had been crucial to my own success in challenging David's misconduct. More importantly, I was able to create an environment where such documentation would never be necessary because harassment and intimidation would not be tolerated. The culture change at Blackstone Industries was comprehensive and lasting. The fear and silence that had characterized David's regime were replaced by open communication, collaborative problem-solving, and mutual respect. Employees felt safe to report concerns, suggest improvements, and challenge decisions when necessary. The productivity improvements that resulted from this cultural change were dramatic. When employees felt safe to speak up about problems, issues were identified and resolved more quickly. When people weren't afraid of retaliation, they were more likely to suggest innovations and improvements. When harassment and intimidation were eliminated, everyone could focus on doing their jobs effectively. The safety record of the company improved significantly as well. The systematic suppression of safety information that had characterized David's approach was replaced by comprehensive reporting and rapid response to potential issues. The automotive component recalls that had resulted from his cover-up were the last major safety incidents in the company's history. 3 years after David's termination, Blackstone Industries received an industry award for safety excellence and employee satisfaction. The company that had once enabled systematic harassment and safety cover-ups had become a model for ethical manufacturing practices and positive workplace culture. The transformation was a testament to the power of individual courage to create systemic change. The stand I had taken against David's misconduct had not only ended his career, but had also catalyzed organizational changes that improved conditions for thousands of employees. The awards ceremony, where the company received recognition for its safety and employee satisfaction achievements, was particularly meaningful. Standing on the stage where David had once humiliated me in front of senior leadership, I was able to present the improvements that had resulted from his accountability. This award belongs to every employee who has had the courage to speak up about safety concerns, I said in my acceptance speech. It belongs to everyone who has refused to accept harassment and intimidation as normal parts of the workplace. Most importantly, it belongs to everyone who has learned that individual action can create systemic change. The speech was well received, but the most meaningful responses came from employees who approached me afterward to share their own stories of finding the courage to report problems, suggest improvements, and challenge inappropriate behavior. The culture of fear that David had created had been completely replaced by a culture of empowerment and accountability. The final chapter in David Sterling's story came 4 years after his termination, when he was sentenced to prison for safety violations related to the automotive component cover-up. The systematic suppression of safety information that had been intended to protect his reputation had ultimately resulted in criminal charges that ended his freedom. The sentencing hearing was the last time I saw David in person. The man who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating appeared diminished and defeated. The system of psychological warfare he had used to destroy so many careers had ultimately destroyed his own life. But my focus wasn't on David's punishment, it was on the positive changes that had resulted from his accountability. The safety reporting procedures that had been implemented at Blackstone Industries had become a model for other companies in the industry. The harassment prevention systems had created a work environment where employees felt safe and valued. The systematic documentation methods I had developed during my 5 weeks under David's supervision had been formalized into training programs for employees facing similar situations. The strategic alliance-building techniques that had been crucial to my success had been incorporated into the company's conflict resolution procedures. Most importantly, the courage to stand up for principles, even when it meant risking career advancement, had become a valued part of the company culture. Employees knew that doing the right thing would be supported, not punished, and that speaking up about problems would be rewarded, not retaliated against. The morning that David had scheduled my destruction had indeed marked the end of a career at Blackstone Industries, but it was his career, not mine. The performance review that was supposed to eliminate me from his sphere of influence had instead eliminated him from the company entirely. The systematic harassment that was intended to break down my confidence had ultimately broken down his own professional reputation. The documentation that he had inadvertently taught me to maintain had become the foundation for my success in challenging his misconduct and implementing systemic changes that would prevent similar abuse. The strategic thinking skills he had forced me to develop had become the basis for my effectiveness in creating positive workplace culture. In the end, David Sterling's greatest contribution to my career was teaching me exactly what kind of leader I never wanted to become. His methods showed me the importance of treating employees with respect, creating safe environments for reporting concerns, and prioritizing integrity over personal advancement. The revenge I had taken wasn't personal, it was professional. It wasn't about destroying David Sterling. It was about building systems that would prevent anyone from using his methods again. The accountability he had faced wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was consequences designed to protect future employees from similar abuse. The morning he had planned to end my career became the morning that launched my most meaningful professional work. The systematic harassment that was supposed to drive me from the company had instead driven me to create the kind of workplace where such harassment would be impossible. The performance review scheduled for 7 a.m. in an empty office, designed to ensure that nobody would hear me cry, had instead ensured that everyone would hear David Sterling's final accountability. The isolation he had orchestrated had been broken. The narrative he had controlled had been challenged, and the methods he had perfected had been exposed and eliminated. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience wasn't David's punishment. It was the knowledge that no other employee would have to endure what I had experienced. The systematic documentation, strategic alliance building, and comprehensive evidence presentation that had been necessary to challenge his misconduct had been formalized into systems that would make such challenges unnecessary. The culture of fear, intimidation, and silence that had enabled David's abuse had been replaced by a culture of respect, empowerment, and accountability. The company that had once allowed systematic harassment and safety cover-ups had become a model for ethical business practices and positive workplace culture. Standing in the office where David had once tried to destroy my career, now serving as Director of Quality Assurance with the authority to ensure that such destruction would never happen again, I realized that his most important lesson hadn't been about documentation or strategic thinking. It had been about the power of individual courage to create systemic change. The morning that was supposed to end my career had instead become the beginning of my most meaningful professional work. The systematic harassment that was designed to break me down had instead built me up into a leader who could protect others from similar abuse. The performance review that was scheduled to eliminate me from David's sphere of influence had instead eliminated him from the company entirely. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't personal. It was professional. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. It wasn't about destroying David Sterling. It was about building a workplace where his methods could never be used again. The conference room where he had planned to break me down in isolation had become the place where he faced accountability in front of the people who mattered most. The documentation he had inadvertently taught me to maintain had become the evidence that ended his career and launched my own transformation into a leader who would never allow such abuse to happen again. The morning of the performance review, when David Sterling leaned across his desk and whispered that nobody would hear me cry, he was right, but not in the way he intended. Nobody heard me cry, because I didn't cry. Instead, they heard his desperate attempts to justify the unjustifiable as his carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of systematic documentation and strategic accountability. The early morning timing that was supposed to provide him with privacy and control had instead provided the perfect setting for his final confrontation with the consequences of his own misconduct. The isolation he had orchestrated had been broken. The narrative he had controlled had been challenged, and the methods he had perfected had been exposed and eliminated forever.